Okay, good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Axel Handemeyer. I'm the Associate Dean Academic in the Faculty of Science, and on behalf of the Faculty of Science, welcome to the by now 31st edition of Soup and Science. I'm going to give you some introductory remarks, and the very first thing I would like to say is that we all acknowledge that McGill University is on land long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. So, and now it's my pleasure, my great pleasure, to introduce our wonderful speakers today. They will be presenting their research. And the people we have today is, we will start with Professor Kevin Manaugh from the Department of Geography and the McGill School of Environment, followed by Professor David Rolnick by the School of Computer Science, and then Professor Ivy Tan from the Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences Department, and then at the end, Professor Stephanie Weber from the Department of Biology. So after the presentations, I mean, many of you will know how this works, but just in case, once the presentations are finished, we will move into the question and answer portion of this session. Each speaker will be assigned to a breakout room, and you, that is relatively new, you will be able to choose which rooms you want to visit, and you join the breakout room on your own. A few minutes before 12 o'clock, we will all return to the main session for some final remarks. And now I'm done with my introduction, so we are ready to get started. And we will start with our very first presenter, Professor Kevin Manaugh of the Department of Geography and the McGill School of Environment.
Great, thanks a lot, Axel. Hi, good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here in this new format for Soup and Science. My office isn't quite as nice as the Red Path, but I'm interested to do it in this format. So, as Axel said, I'm in geography in the School of Environment. I'm also an associate member of the School of Urban Planning, and a lot of the work I'll be talking about today will be based on my work as part of the McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative, the Adapting Urban Environments for the Future, which I co-lead. So I'll be talking a kind of a whirlwind history of sort of cities and urbanism and the role of transport in the sort of 3 or 4 minutes that I have here. And one thing I like to think about when I'm thinking about this sort of evolution and change of cities and sustainability is thinking about sort of where we came from in terms of the role of cities and what they used to look like. And these are obviously, older pictures, right? But a lot of our images and ideas of sort of urbanism in cities is often based on these kind of ideas of these really overcrowded and smelly and congested and unsafe and these kind of environments. And the whole profession and sort of philosophical background of urban planning came from trying to basically get rid of these kind of environments, get people out of these crowded inner city type of places. And this was one of the most influential ideas, was the garden city idea. And as you can see from the title here, the idea is these slumless and smokeless cities. And so this really well-intentioned idea, which we could talk about for hours in terms of how this worked, but right now I want to talk about these kind of unintended impacts. A lot of these ideas of getting people out of cities and out of these really crowded places led, indirectly and directly to these kind of development patterns. And we can see here what we would call single-use residential zoning. And so you can see that all we see are houses. There isn't an elementary school that children can walk or cycle to. There aren't, places you can just go buy groceries. You really have to get into a car and go along these kind of curvilinear streets and get on a highway to get anywhere you need to go. And at the same time, we often refer to these as obesogenic environments, these kind of places that sort of discourage physical activity, encourage this kind of idea. So a lot of these really well-intentioned impacts of wanting to get people healthier and happier and get out of these crowded, unsafe places led to these other environmental and public health issues. I mean, not only these sort of direct impacts of the built environment on health, but also the people who are suffering from climate change impacts and who live very, very far away from these specific suburbs, but whose impacts are felt there. And so, and at the same time, this is just kind of a biophysical fact, whether this is a good or a bad thing would be a different discussion, but there's vast difference in development patterns across the world. In fact, if everyone lived as densely as they do in the city of Manaugh, the human race could fit in Tunisia, right? So there's a vast difference in how people are distributed in space. And so that's where sort of the work that I do, I'm really focused on this role of cities, both the sort of the sort of positive and the negative. And I think, as we all know, the majority of people on the planet now live in cities. So it depends exactly kind of on what definition you're using. It might be 60, it might be 70%, but it's a lot of people, and this trend is continuing. And so what I do as part of MSSI and part of my own work is really kind of guided by this vision of research. So knowledge to improve human well-being while making cities more resilient, inclusive, and less environmentally impactful. And we do that, my lab and my colleagues, we do that through answering some specific questions around, exactly like what kind of development patterns can maximize things like carbon sequestration, biodiversity, clean air, while also fostering healthy and happy people. It's not just a question of environmental sustainability, it's a question of how people fit in that, and how the health and well-being of people can also be maximized. Then most of my research focuses specifically on transport systems, and again, the similar kind of question of we want to maximize these good things like mobility and efficiency, connectiveness, and minimize things like environmental damage. And we sort of engage critically with this idea of can cities really save the planet? There's a lot of rhetoric sort of in contrast to what we saw from 1850s London in those first images, but the idea that we've all really embraced this idea of cities saving the planet, but we really want to make sure that that's something that's feasible. And so with that, I'll say thanks, and I'm happy to take questions and engage with folks who are interested in this when we have the breakout rooms. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. And now we're moving on to our next speaker, who is Professor David Rolnick of the School of Computer Science.
Sorry, I was having some issues unmuting myself. Hi, everyone. My name is David Rolnick, and I am in the School of Computer Science and also part of the Mila Quebec AI Institute. I'm going to be talking about climate change and machine learning. I don't think the problem of climate change needs that much introduction. We're seeing its effects already, and they are increasing. Increasingly frequent and severe storms, droughts, fires in many cases are influenced by climate change, though not in all cases. Flooding caused by those more powerful storms and also caused by rising sea levels, extreme heat, and many, many other effects. You can see these bleached corals over on the right-hand side. And in addition, it's worth remembering that climate change exacerbates global inequities. Often the places that are hardest hit by climate change are the places that are already disadvantaged. The cause of climate change is human-made greenhouse gas emissions, in particular carbon dioxide and methane, also a number of other smaller factors. And we need net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, according to the UN. But every year emissions continue to actually go up, not going down fast enough. They're still going up, with the exception of right now because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it's expected that business as usual will be right back to normal, barring changes in our trajectory. Tackling climate change means both reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's called mitigation, and resilience to the effects of climate change, both the effects that we've already had now and the effects that are sort of guaranteed to happen because of what we've already locked ourselves into, and that's called adaptation. And we can choose just how bad climate change is going to be. Now, climate change is a really big, complicated problem. There isn't one thing that needs to be done. There are a lot of things that need to be done. And I'm going to talk about machine learning, which is one of a huge number of tools which can be applied to climate change. It's not the most important one, but it's the one that I work on because I am a computer scientist. So what is machine learning? Oops, I don't know how to go back there. Okay, cool. Machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence just means algorithms that allow computers to perform complicated tasks. Machine learning is that subset of AI that is about the computers sort of learning the right algorithms, learning how to extract patterns from large amounts of data. They're particularly good, these algorithms, at performing tasks at scale that a human might not want to do that number of times. It might be impractical. Optimizing complicated system with lots of knobs to turn, working out exactly the right way to turn those knobs, distilling useful information from a really large set of data. But they also have limitations. If the data is bad, then you get bad results. If the data is biased, or if the application setting is biased, then it can perpetuate those biases, and it can also make them seem objective. So machine learning can make things worse if you think that it's coming up with the right answer, but it's actually coming up with the wrong answer. And it also assumes that patterns are persistent. So if your data is changing over time, then you can end up with huge issues. So that's machine learning. How can machine learning be relevant in climate change? There are a bunch of different themes for how these two tie together. The first theme is machine learning being used in gathering information, distilling large amounts of data into useful insights, often for policymakers or other decision makers, in tracking greenhouse gas emissions, pinpointing infrastructure like buildings and other aspects of the built environment, and monitoring biodiversity, which is something my group works on. In forecasting, understanding the supply and demand for renewable energy like solar and wind, transportation, and forecasting extreme events as well. Improving the operational efficiency of complicated systems, like reducing the energy needed for heating and cooling buildings, optimizing freight and supply chains, and reducing food waste. Accelerating the process of scientific experimentation itself by recommending parameters or materials to try in experiments, not replacing experiments, but augmenting human intuition and designing better ones, for example, creating batteries, catalysts, and other materials for clean energy. And approximating time-intensive simulations, so simulations where we understand the physics, but it's very time-consuming or computation-consuming to run it exactly. So for example, in big climate and weather models where there are pieces which can be approximated to make them much faster, likewise in modeling energy and city planning and other contexts. These are some of the overarching themes for how machine learning can be relevant to climate change. I should caution that machine learning is not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve climate change. Many climate change strategies don't need machine learning at all. And where it is applicable, it's only one part of the strategy. There are other tools which are much more important from climate change. I'm not encouraging people who want to work on climate change to suddenly turn to machine learning and AI. Work on policy. Policy is more important. Work on other things, which are also very important. But machine learning can be an important tool. It's also worth remembering the impactful applications of machine learning that one hears about are often, the flashy applications that one hears about are often actually the less impactful ones. Things like predictive maintenance and freight routing may be extremely impactful, but they don't necessarily make the headlines. Machine learning also does have bad applications in climate change as in other areas. It's being applied to accelerate oil and gas exploration and extraction. So there are applications of machine learning that are actively negative for the climate as well. Like any other technology, it can be used to accelerate what people do, either good or bad. And to help positive impacts for machine learning, partnerships are key with people who understand the relevant space, researchers, industry, end users, and communities that are being affected, policymakers and other stakeholders. And it's really important to ensure equity, both in who is understanding these tools and who is involved in developing and deploying them throughout the pipeline. If you're interested in this space, I encourage you to check out climatechange.ai, which is a volunteer initiative that I also help run. And thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. And now, David, and now let's move on to our next speaker. And that next speaker is Professor Ivy Tan of the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences.
So thank you for the invitation to speak at this event. I'm going to briefly introduce some of the research I'm working on to better understand the role of clouds in a changing climate. Okay, so there's no doubt that the global mean surface air temperature is rising in response to increases in carbon dioxide. All climate models agree on that, but what they disagree on is how much the Earth will warm in response to increasing CO2 emissions. So in this time series here of projected warming, some climate models show a much higher degree of warming, like the one in red, while others project a much lesser degree of warming, like the one in blue. And what's particularly interesting to me is that the Arctic is warming at a much faster pace compared to the rest of the globe, about 2 to 3 times the rate. And you can see that here in this global map here on your left, which shows that the ensemble global mean surface air temperature relative to the historical period in climate models is largest in the Arctic. Climate models also show the largest spread in projected warming in the Arctic. And you can see this on the plot on your right here, where the 2 sigma spread of the models is largest in the Arctic region. So why the large spread in climate projections? Well, clouds contribute the largest spread, and this is a problem that has been known since the 1990s. We've come a long way since then, but there's still a lot of uncertainty associated with the cloud feedback. And by cloud feedback, we mean the surface temperature mediated response of clouds and how the clouds in turn feed back onto the global surface temperature warming. So the feedback is positive if it exacerbates the warming, or it's negative if it damps global warming. And I'm particularly interested in cold clouds that are comprised of both supercooled liquid droplets and ice crystals, known as mixed phase clouds. These clouds are found all over the globe, but they're particularly ubiquitous in the Arctic, where they persist year-round. So now the reason why clouds are so difficult to represent in climate models is largely due to the difference between the spatial scales of clouds and the climate model grid scale. So while clouds start forming on the submicron scale, the climate model grid scale, on the other hand, is typically on the order of about 100 kilometers in the horizontal and 1 kilometer in the vertical. So in order to represent clouds, climate models need to rely on these so-called parametrizations, which essentially relate these small-scale unresolved variables to the large-scale variables that are actually resolved by the model. And Arctic clouds are particularly poorly represented in climate models because of the complex web of interactions between a number of different processes and the fact that they are also poorly constrained by a lack of observations. So one main question that my research aims to answer is, what are the dominant processes that are important for cloud feedbacks? In order to narrow the spread in cloud feedbacks, we first need to understand mechanistically what the dominant drivers of the feedback are, and then how to better constrain them. And a leading hypothesis for explaining the cloud feedback outside the tropical regions is phase changes from ice to liquid clouds that act as a negative feedback to global warming. We've shown using satellite observations and climate models as tools in the past that this feedback is likely overestimated in climate models. Another main theme of my research is how to use observations to improve the parameterization of mixed phase clouds in climate models. Mixed phase clouds in particular suffer from the fact that climate models neglect the subgrid variability in how the liquid and ice within the clouds are spatially distributed. And this can have huge impacts on the cloud feedback and climate projections. But with the launch of new satellite instruments and also new observations from field campaigns, this is a particularly exciting time to be involved in studying the cloud feedback problem. And we expect to make a lot of progress on this in the near-term future. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ivy. And now we are ready at the last talk of today, and it will be given by Professor Stephanie Weber of the Department of Biology.
Thanks, Axel and Pri for the invitation. So today I want to talk to you guys about my research on organelles without borders. So you guys have probably seen in biology textbooks a picture of a cell that has a bunch of membrane-bound organelles. And the idea here is that a membrane around the nucleus, for example, creates a diffusion barrier between molecules that are inside the organelle and molecules that are in the cytoplasm. And this allows each compartment to maintain a distinct biochemical composition. And so it allows membrane-bound organelles to functionally specialize. So the nucleus maintains the genome, ER and Golgi package and sort proteins, mitochondria make ATP. And all these functions are made possible by this membrane barrier. And in the cytoplasm, there are no membranes, and so molecules are free to diffuse around and mix. Or at least that was the picture until about 10 years ago. When we started to recognize that cells contain numerous types of membrane-less organelles. So these structures, such as germ granules, stress granules, and nuclear bodies, consist of local concentrations of proteins and often RNA that don't have a physical barrier around them, and yet they don't diffuse around throughout the cell. They maintain this concentrated local structure. And so the question is, how and why does this happen? So in addition to not having a membrane, or because they don't have a membrane, these membraneless organelles are highly dynamic. So they can assemble and disassemble in response to developmental, in this C. elegans embryo, or environmental cues. So stress granules in mammalian cells assemble very quickly when a stress is added to the medium, but then it's reversible. They can disassemble when they're no longer needed. And so the question is, how do these molecules come together to form stable structures when they don't have a membrane around them? And a lot of research in the field, and some from my lab, have shown that these membraneless organelles assemble through a process called liquid-liquid phase separation. And this is a complex name, but it's actually a really simple concept that you guys are probably all familiar with. So it's the spontaneous demixing of a supersaturated solution into two or more coexisting phases. So if you think about liquid mixtures that you're familiar with, alcohol and water, oil and vinegar, they can either exist in a mixed state or in a demixed state. And in your salad dressing, the oil and the vinegar, there's no membrane, there's no physical barrier between them, and yet they still exist in two distinct phases. And so we think that this is what is happening inside a cell. And so the question is now, what do these membraneless organelles do inside cells? And they regulate many different cellular processes. So they've been shown to regulate cytoskeleton dynamics, so the actin polymerization. They regulate signal transduction in response to cellular stress, and they can also regulate gene expression. So these are transcription factors that form at specific sites of specific genes that can either activate or repress transcription. So in my lab, we are interested in nucleoli, which are membraneless organelles in the nucleus of cells. And again, they're highly dynamic in the cell cycle. They assemble and disassemble by various different physical processes that we can quantify and compare to theory. And ultimately, we're interested in how these membraneless organelles coordinate activity across length scales. So at the cellular level, we see these phase separation processes occur, but it regulates transcription at the molecular level, as well as growth of the organism at larger length scales. And so with that, I will stop, and hopefully we can move to the breakout room, and I'd be happy to take any questions you have.